Владимир Георгиевич.
Святаго Духа, окропление воды вся священная во имя Отца и Сына и Святаго Духа. Аминь.
I guess you're asking yourself a question, what did you just watch? Well, this is just an Orthodox priest opening a monument to Stalin. My name is Zach, I'm 22 years old Russian who left Russia because of the war against Ukraine, and today I'm gonna tell you about Stalinization of Russia. Who is Stalin? Well, he is a Soviet dictator who was taking the power after Lenin died in 1924, and he was ruling over the USSR since 1924 all the way to 1953 until his death. So he ruled in total about 29 years. His actual surname is Jugashvili. He is, by the way, Georgian. Shout out to Gatsu. He is famous in Russia for two things: being a so-called effective leader, and secondly, being one of the most cruel leaders of Russia of all times. Speaking of being an effective leader, he turned agrarian Russia into more of a modern Russia with a bunch of fabrics, with a bunch of manufacturers, and a lot of communists praise Stalin for being one of the most effective communist leader of all times. However, they would never tell you about at what cost Stalin did that. There are different estimations how many people were oppressed during the rule of Stalin. For example, the famous dissident and the really famous Soviet writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in his book The Gulag Archipelago, he says that about 60 million of people were oppressed, were killed and sent to gulags while the rule of Stalin. However, at the same time, the Open University claimed that there is only proofs for 5.5 million of people being oppressed during the rule of Stalin. For me, Stalin is one of the most cruel and one of the most totalitarian rulers of Russia, Soviet Union of all times. I can compare Stalin to Hitler by the amount of crimes he committed. Today we're speaking about re-Stalinization, which means the increase in sympathy towards Stalin and his actions during his rule. First monuments were installed in 1930s in the USSR during the forming of the cult of Stalin. At first, monuments to Stalin were in most of the Soviet cities, and later, after the Second World War, they started to appear in Eastern Europe. However, in 1953, Stalin dies and Nikita Khrushchev comes to power. And what Nikita Khrushchev does, he says that whatever Stalin did, it was all wrong. Stalin is a killer, Stalin is a criminal, and so the new era of de-Stalinization happens. At the time of the collapse of the USSR, only 10 monuments to Stalin still existed in the whole USSR. Later, during the 90s, when Yeltsin came to power and it was a so-called democracy, Stalin was not really in favor, and only 5 monuments were created in the territory of Russia from 1991 all the way to 2000. So by the time Putin comes to power at the year of 1999, there were only 15 monuments to Stalin all over Russia. However, after 24 years of Putin's rule, right now there are about 110 monuments of Stalin in Russia. In the first 10 years of Putin's rule, he installed 37 monuments of Stalin, something about 4 monuments per year. However, after 2014, when Putin annexed Crimea and started the war in Donbass, the amount of buildings of monuments of Stalin in Russia increased in 2 times. Since the beginning of the war against Ukraine in 2022, already 4 new monuments of Stalin were opened in Russia. There is a whole document of all 110 Stalin monuments in Russia. Monuments of Stalin are installed at least in 40 regions of Russia, and in 15 of the capitals of the regions there is a monument. The regions with the most amount of Stalin's monuments are North Ossetia Republic. They have 24 monuments of Stalin. And maybe the reasons for this is because there is a theory that Stalin was actually not Georgian but Ossetian, which is kind of close, but Stalin himself disapproved this theory of his origins. Then it goes Dagestan Republic, where they have 9 monuments of Stalin in different cities and villages, and then, for some reason, Yakutia, which is really far from Caucasus region, and they have about 8 monuments in different cities and villages. Sometimes it is officials who install those monuments. In some cases, those are just, private people who are doing this because they feel like they have sympathy and just in general they like Stalin, but overall it's not prohibited. For example, here in the city of Shelanger in Republic of Mari El, the communists installed the monument of Stalin, which is symbolically standing right at the gates of the meat processing company. In my first ever video on YouTube, I remember I was going around my city and filming, the city, giving my comments, telling about some stories. Unfortunately, I had to delete this video because of the copyright issues. Maybe someday I will assemble it back because I have all the files. While filming this video, I've seen the monument to Stalin.
So here you can see some babushkas staring at some heroes and generals. This is like a little alley of heroes of the war. And there are some generals, but you don't expect to see him here. This is, as you may see, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. I don't know if this is acceptable to have a statue of Stalin between heroes who won the war. Many Russians still love Stalin, even though he killed a lot of Russian people. He just imprisoned a lot of Russian and a lot of Soviet people. A lot of Soviet people in Gulag. But there are still people who love him, and I think people who just built this monument are also in love with his ideas.
And I was really surprised. Why would a city in the Far East would even have a monument of Stalin? And one of my main takes in that video, I guess some of my old viewers can remember that my city was kind of built by the Gulag prisoners, the people who were sent to Gulags because of Stalin, the people who were oppressed by Stalin. And here you go, they build the city, and their bones are forever laying in the graves in Komsomolsk-on-Amur because they were sent somewhere from the central part of Russia or western part of Russia all the way to the Far East to build those cities that were not really needed out there. And eventually they've put this stone of this dictator in this city where so many people died building the city in really harsh conditions when it's minus 40 Celsius during the winter, plus 40 Celsius during the summer, bunch of swamps around, mosquitoes. So many people died because of different diseases and because of lack of food and because of the weather. And here you go, they literally install a monument of the person who made so many people to die building this city. And this is just really cynical. And I was really surprised when I've seen this in the city of Komsomolsk-on-Amur. After the start of the war against Ukraine, many Russian officials are speaking about Stalin in a really positive way. Putin claimed himself that Stalin, Lenin, and Nicholas II are the people who made Russia great.
И имена как Николай II, Ленин, Сталин сделали Россию великой мировой державой, определили ее судьбу.
The Minister of Foreign Affairs Sergei Lavrov said this about Stalin. By the way, the attacks on Stalin as the main villain, the lumping together of everything he did before the war, during and after the war, this is also a part of the same attack on our past, on the results of the Second World War. One of the most famous Z writers of Russia, Zakhar Prilepin, he said that he would put monuments of Stalin all over Russia in every place. Where here, one of the so-called politologists of Russia, Yevgeny Satanovsky, actually his surname sounds like devilish, because Satana, that's a devil in Russian, and his surname is Sir Satanovsky, so like a devilish. Yevgeny Devilish, in the Life at the Solovyov, at the Russian Goebbels, so two really noble people, discussed Stalin.
Сталинские лагеря очень многих людей приучили как минимум видеть в соседе по нарам человека.
Конечно.
А не жидовскую морду или какого-нибудь попа, которого к стенке надо ставить.
Another character, Dmitry Medvedev, an ex-president of Russia from 2008 to 2012, he said that during the Second World War, Stalin really threatened the producers of weapons, and that's why they won.
Через несколько дней, если вы окажетесь нарушителями своего долга перед Родиной, начну вас громить как преступников, пренебрегающих честью и интересами своей Родины. Нельзя терпеть, чтобы наши войска страдали на фронте от недостатка танков, запятая, а вы в далеком тылу прохлаждались и бездельничали. Иосиф Сталин, 17 сентября 1941 года.
And by saying this, basically Medvedev is threatening to do the same to the military production people in nowadays Russia if they're not gonna produce as much of weapons as they need to win in Ukraine. Or here, Vladimir Medinsky, one of the friends of Putin, and back then he was a minister of culture, and recently he wrote a book for high schoolers about the history of the USSR in the 20th century. I actually have a video about this whole Z propaganda book. Some time ago, he went to Tver Oblast to open one of the Stalin's monuments. However, not all regions of Russia want to have the monument of Stalin on their territory, especially those who suffered from deportations of nations from their territories. The head of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, publicly cursed on Stalin for deporting Chechens. On February 23, 1944, Stalin did it. We were deprived of everything. Our native land, native homes, acquired for centuries, driven into cattle cars, taken and thrown away in the Altai Mountains, Kazakh steppes, driven into lead, zinc, and uranium mines. None of the wars can be compared to the repressions of Joseph Stalin, damn him forever and ever against the Chechen people. And at the same time, the local parliament of Ingushetia Republic made a law which prohibits installation of monuments to Stalin. And even though there are no formal restrictions on having monuments of Stalin on the federal level, only 40 regions of Russia actually have the monuments, while 43 of the regions don't. Today, the law is on the side of Stalinists. In Russia, there is an official ban on identifying the USSR with Nazi Germany. In fact, the law prohibits discussion of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and Stalin's role in the partition of Europe, for violation of which several criminal cases have already been opened, including against the opposition politician Leonid Gozman. In December 2021, the organization called Memorial, which was engaged in the study of political repressions in the USSR, was also liquidated. Even me, after the law was passed in 2021, I had to delete my video about the 9th of May, the Parade of Victory in Russia, which I visited with my friends back in my hometown before I went to the US. Eventually, in this video, I've mentioned the book of Viktor Suvorov, one of the Russian Soviet dissidents who were an ex-KGB agent and who had to ask for asylum in, I think it was either 1970s or 1980s. And eventually he wrote what he has seen in the Soviet army, in KGB, and eventually he wrote this book called Icebreaker, where he discussed the role of Stalin in the start of the Second World War. Viktor Suvorov doesn't say that Stalin was worse than Hitler, he just says that both of them were monsters. And I really recommend you to read this book if you want to learn more about the Stalin's participation in the start of the Second World War. And since there is a re-Stalinization in Russia going on, how do Russian people treat Stalin? What do they think of Stalin? Let's find out. The study of the organization called Levada Center, which is an organization that, provides different polls. So they had this couple of questions about Stalin and throughout the years, and I'm going to compare two dates. The date of the 2001 and recently in July 2023. The increase of liking Stalin and what he did in the Russian society from 2001 all the way to 2023 is 66%. So it is plus 66%. This is the number on how much Russians started to like Stalin more. What about the critique? Russians started to criticize Stalin on 88% less. And I also find it interesting how the society of Russia started to become more depoliticized, more apolitical, if we can say that. Because in 2001, only 18% were saying that they don't really have the opinion on Stalin, they don't really care, some of them didn't even know who Stalin is, and only 18% of all the people who were asked said that in 2001. However, in 2023, already 29% of people said that they don't really care or they don't really have a position. Some of them didn't even know who Stalin is. We can see that the increase of Russian society being apolitical towards the figure of Stalin is 61% more than in 2001. And eventually Putin achieved what he wanted, depolitization of the society. So people would not really care what is happening in the politics, and he's gonna do anything, and the people would not care. To conclude, it just seems to me that Putin sees Stalin as a role figure. He wants to stay in power as long as Stalin, at least for 29 years. This is the years amount of Stalin's rule, and Putin is already on his 24th year of rule. This is why Putin installed 95 monuments to Stalin in his 24 years of rule of Russia, and never would drop a word of criticism towards Stalin and repressions and the amount of people who were killed during the rule of Stalin. So it was me, Zach the Russian. Thank you for watching this video. If you want to support what I do, there's going to be links in the description below for Patreon and PayPal. Don't forget to support Ukraine. As usual, there is going to be peace in Ukraine and freedom in Russia. See you in the next videos.